Thank you, and what a wonderful presentation and lots of wonderful data to inform these important decisions. I just wanted to ask if you think what you can draw from this experience to the national experience and how we can learn from what happened in Boulder to what might happen on a national scale. And I think back to your data point about average 22 miles of distance between charging. So given that that is a fairly small distance, how does that affect our need for either batteries or charging infrastructure?
Right. So that's one of the points I was trying to make. So the again, restricted to the Boulder environment, which does have not unusually short trip distances, the 22 miles per of distance traveled between charging is indeed surprisingly a small number. The data we have available at this level of granularity and quality US-wide is non-existent. We have to understand the Toyota demo program was at various locations in the US, but it was no attempt to make this representative nationwide. So we don't know exactly what that number would be nationwide. The number that we have for this limited data set nationwide was 31 miles, right, distance between charging. But let's say it is 40 miles between, distance between charging, which is a often quoted number. I think that's what probably drove Volt to have a 40-mile, range. You can, I think, very meaningfully talk about these two paths of meeting, if the goal is to displace oil, right? And one path would be to enlarge the battery so it covers most of that distance between charging events. The other one is to enhance the opportunity to charge more often. And I think there are technical and economic angles you can take in that discussion. From my point of view and my experience as engineering perspective, the option of actually having charging infrastructure in place as opposed to enlarging the battery size would be easier to accomplish. From a technical perspective, I'm not going to talk about the economic perspective at all. Now when you talk about the charging infrastructure, it's not just the existence of charging infrastructure, but I think even more importantly, the convenience. Barbara pointed to some of these examples in Boulder, and even at houses, the method of plugging into the wall is not what you normally associate with the use of a vehicle. And we see that there were cases where people wouldn't charge even overnight. They simply forget. It's very understandable. Just the process of plugging in is not automatic in your brain that you associate with driving the vehicle. And so what I think after this study here, and my research or development is related to that, is that the convenience of charging is actually more important than we thought. And technologies such as inductive charging perhaps would be looked at more seriously than we suspected. So something that would be just as easy as using, technology works best when you don't see it. You just drive at home, park, and you do nothing, and the vehicle is charged, right? That's the type of convenience we're talking about.
I think we've convinced you, finally. From the social science perspective, I think we finally convinced Dragan that it really is something. It was said earlier today that charging stations should be put in multifamily buildings and commercial buildings, where people work, and that is absolutely where charging infrastructure should go. I'm a little concerned about putting it out in shopping centers where people are less likely to use it. And I'm concerned about this inductive charging notion because of the concerns about EMF and so forth. I think there could be real concerns about wireless. In other words, pushback on the part of people about having that kind of technology around town. So whether warranted or not, it's something that could occur. So I think if people could plug in at work and where they live in apartments, that kind of thing, that would be a really first choice place to develop charging infrastructure from the social science perspective.
Hi, I'm going to be devil's advocate for
somebody else had their hand up, but okay. It's all right, go ahead.
For just a moment. The Boulder, or the demographic that you described is Well, it may not be unique, but it's among the uniques of
Fair.
the world. How much of what you learned is unique to Boulder versus, can be kind of universally applied? I'm not saying it's not valuable to you guys, but how much of it, if we're walking away, and I'm going to write a story about this tomorrow, how much of it is universally applicable?
So what the reason
what of your learning is?
The reason that Boulder was selected is because it was charging in a smart grid environment. So there aren't that many places where this could have been done. And we did learn that this feedback, the online feedback, was not particularly useful in people managing their charging. And it's not just a matter of building a better website or something like that. It truly is inconvenient from people's perspective as a way of charging. So, there's need for technology development to have systems that allow people to set it and forget it, to override, and so forth. So I think that's a critical finding that we're talking about a well-educated population here, a motivated population that's concerned about the environment. And so I think that's a lesson that really has broad applicability. Yes?
One question for each of you, actually. The first is what the hypothesis for reconciling that, I think it was 76% of people were not satisfied with the EV range,
Yeah.
but 71% said they would buy it, or
Yes.
they would buy one.
So how do I?
Yeah, so what kind of your hypothesis
So
around that?
71% didn't say they would buy it. They said they would consider buying it. And there were some deal breakers, one of which was the short EV range. So it wasn't that they said they would buy it. I will say one person did buy it, although it's not available in Colorado, but one person did buy it. But the 76% that I showed in the later slide was during the interview. I explained during the interviews, if people we talked about satisfaction with EV range specifically, not just with the vehicle. And there are many aspects that go into being willing to purchase the vehicle. It wasn't just EV range, but some people said they were pretty happy with 14 miles, although when they explained it to other people would be shocked that it was only 14 miles. And they'd have to say, yes, but I get 80 miles a gallon, So if they were running these short errands around town, they tended to be pretty satisfied with that. But the problem is they wanted to go other places. So for purposes of that analysis, we did code everybody who talked about wanting to use the vehicle to go skiing or to go to Longmont or Denver International Airport or whatever as not satisfied, just to bifurcate. But it's obviously much more complex than that.
And just a quick follow-up is if the research, the data spoke to, from a product development side, what size battery would be optimum? I think you alluded to it, but.
Right, so maybe to follow up on this general question of the battery size, there is a preconception that this battery size is kind of the key thing that you're actually buying when you buy a plug-in vehicle. It reminds me of what has been going on, for example, in microprocessors when they were competing who is going to have a higher clock rate, right? And you buy a processor that has a higher clock rate and assume that's going to be better. And there's one company, right? And another company was saying, well, it doesn't really matter, the performance really matters, but it didn't really work out very well. So I think it's a similar analogy here. So you say, well, you say a 30-mile battery is better than 20-mile battery. Well, but you have to pay more for it, right? And in fact, the additional payment that you have for the extra battery size may be not a very good decision. And it may depend strongly on the type of environment that where you use the vehicle, right? So in this particular case, even though many people said they were not satisfied, with the EV range, I think that to a large extent can be attributed to this preconception that 10 miles is nothing, right? I talk to my friends and they say, well, we have this cool vehicle that we are testing. What's the range? Well, it's like 14 miles. Oh, it's nothing. But it's just a preconception. When you look at the performance within an environment that's urban, where the distances are small and you have opportunities to charge, that vehicle actually performs very well. So it depends on where the vehicle is actually used and how it's actually used. So it's hard to tell what a good battery size is based on this study right here. But more generally, we see what the trends are. So back to your question, some of our numbers can be associated with Boulder specific, right? What is the miles per gallon, and so on. But I think some of the ideas that we have presented are applied generally in terms of the battery size, charging infrastructure, convenience of charging being crucial to the success of the plug-in vehicles.
Two things quickly. First, you mentioned something about it not being desirable to charge in shopping centers. I didn't quite understand the rationale for that. And question number two is, in terms of this EV range not being enough, when you asked people, okay, fine, this might have had like a 4 kilowatt hour type battery on there or something, 4 or 5, and if you want an 8 or 12 or 16, and you kind of show them what it means in terms of cost, I mean, you can't have that discussion without putting a price tag on it. It's like, great, I mean, I'd like a 200 kilowatt hour battery in my truck. Is only going to cost $150,000 to put that in there. It would be great if it were free, but it isn't free. So once you've explained the price tag to people, I mean, do they want to buy a mink coat, or do they want to buy some cotton something? That's
we did ask to the latter question. We did ask what the trade-offs were between what they were willing to pay and how far the vehicle would go, but people, I don't have those data just memorized, so I can't just rattle that off to you, but in general, people were starting to hesitate at, $32,000, and even if for this vehicle, and, so there is, the point was made earlier about the price points. These people had spent about $25,000 on their primary vehicles, roughly.
So this is the Prius plug-in, right? So the base price for the Prius plug-in happens to coincidentally be exactly $32,000.
And they were, what I'm trying to say is, although I don't remember all the data points on this, they were starting to hesitate at that kind of price point for this vehicle. So clearly, there are going to be problems. On the other hand, if you have a very high income household, they might want a Tesla. I mean, so. On the first point, the rationale for saying maybe shopping centers aren't the first place that I would put charging infrastructure is simply that households described places where they wanted to charge, which was at work, and places where they would be longer. That's what we sort of noticed at the time of use people charging off-site. They were there longer. So it wasn't clear that shopping centers were places where cars would be the longest period of time. In other words, it's better to put infrastructure in places where people will be longer so that they will get the maximum charge. My concern is that behaviorally, they won't take the trouble to plug in when it's just a relatively short stop.